that same food can be raised either the wrong way and destroy an ecosystem, or it can be raised the right way and regenerate an ecosystem. And when I realized that, it was just like my head exploded, and I was like, oh my God. So you're saying that my personal health and planetary health are directly connected, and the choices I make on a daily basis for the food that I put in my body can also be the food that is going to save us from climate change and is going to like reverse desertification and help, create landscape resilience for droughts or flooding, or help local economies, and like all these various global crises that we're facing, they all come back to how we manage our land.
This is the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. Revitalizing the world together. Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. This is your host, Neil Collins. It is a show that is supported by our work at Latitude Realty. In it, we explore our natural and built environments and how they can be used as a force for good. The show sets out to inspire impactful ideas, meaningful change, human wellness, and ecological restoration through interviews and easy-to-digest conversations. Our guests range from industry leaders to iconoclasts, from both well-known figures to everyday people leading extraordinary lives. This is a show for people looking for education and inspiration on how real estate can be done differently. Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Neil, the host of the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. I'm really excited about today's interview with Bobby Gill, who leads development and communications at the Savory Institute. Bobby, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Neil. Really wonderful to be here. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, Bobby, I'm really excited because I watched a TED Talk that you did about holistic management. And then I started to realize, oh, you know what? I need to get somebody on the show that can really talk about this. It's such a big part of the regenerative work that we're seeing just rise across the globe. But why don't you introduce yourself to everybody before even we talk about the Savory Institute's work? Just who are you and where are you?
Sure. My name is Bobby. I'm in Denver, Colorado. I originally hail from the Washington, D.C. area, grew up there, moved out to Colorado about 5 or 6 years ago now, and, absolutely love, living close to the mountains, be able to go out and ski and hit the trails and all that good stuff. My background, by training, I'm a biological resources engineer. So, after college, I worked, my first gig was with the Food and Drug Administration. So I went more the biomedical route and basically designed clinical trials and, evaluated the safety and effectiveness of medical devices before they were allowed onto the market. So I was approving devices and did that for 8 years or so. And that was all great and wonderful and, kind of along the lines of like, well, I like biology. I like the natural world. I want to improve health. And so that seemed like the course that I wanted to take. But it didn't really light a fire under me. It wasn't really where my passion lied. And, as time went on, I realized that my passion was more along the lines of, really, it started as personal health. And that was more, at the time in my, mid-20s, I was running ultra marathons, so 50-mile, 100-mile races, on trails out in Virginia and places like that. And, I was looking for a competitive edge for what I could do to really, eke out, and get, those podium finishes. And I, at the time I came across a book about the paleo diet, which I had never heard of before, but, I used my, critical thinking that I applied towards, my work at the FDA, and I applied it towards diet and nutrition. And I went, oh, Interesting. So you're saying that if we look at how we evolved to eat, there are certain foods that provide optimal nutrition for human health. That makes a lot of sense. You look at it through the lens of evolutionary biology. And that became a big thing for me. And I started following that. And then a couple of years later, I was, as we all do, just kind of on the internet putzing around. And I saw a TED Talk by Alan Savory. And it was all about reversing desertification and combating climate change by how livestock are grazed. And in watching that TED Talk, I realized that what I had been doing with, this ancestral health thing of, taking an evolutionary biology perspective for what it means for optimal human health, that same approach could be taken towards how that food I was looking for was grown and how those animals, for all that healthy grass-fed beef that I was interested in eating because, it had a healthy omega-3/6 ratio and great bioavailability of nutrients and all this other stuff, that same food can be raised either the wrong way and destroy an ecosystem, or it can be raised the right way and regenerate an ecosystem. And when I realized that, it was just like, my head exploded and I was like, oh my God. So you're saying that my personal health and planetary health are directly connected. And the choices I make on a daily basis for the food that I put in my body can also be the food that is going to save us from climate change and is going to reverse desertification and help, create landscape resilience for droughts or flooding or help local economies and all these various global crises that we're facing, they all come back to how we manage our land. Wow. That's wild. And so, I kind of started down the course of changing careers and ventured off into the nonprofit space and moved out to Colorado. And now I'm proud to work with the team at the Savory Institute. And, this is, what I do day in and day out is, we're a nonprofit. We help farmers and ranchers around the world implement better grazing practices to do so that they can regenerate the world's grasslands. And, I lead up all of our fundraising and marketing and, with my engineering background, I dabble in a lot of the science as well. And it's just incredibly meaningful work. And I'm very glad that I made the career change.
How did you go from watching Alan Savory's TED Talk to working for the Savory Institute? I mean, was that intentional or purely by coincidence?
So I knew I wanted to get out of the FDA. I knew that wasn't where I needed to be. And so, I was running ultras. Some friends and we started a series of charity runs. And I knew I wanted to get out of the DC region as well. It was time for a change. So we set up shop in Denver. So that allowed me to kind of start the career transition and move out to the mountains. And I did that for a few years, ran the organization as chief operating officer. And, these charity runs, we were bringing in, $5 million a year for this rare genetic disorder, funding research. And that was all great and all. But again, it's not where my passion was. And I knew that there was something different. And Savory Institute is headquartered just right up the road, 45 minutes up the street in Boulder. And I saw they were hiring for a director of development. And I was like, hey, I know how to do nonprofit fundraising. I'll do it. And so, I had some I had some personal connections that I was able to utilize to get introduced to the folks on the Savory team. And, the rest is history.
Oh, what a cool story to really connect it back with the TED Talk and also your personal health and fitness. That's truly an incredible way to really explore this conversation. And that's why I wanted to jump into the Savory Institute's work. I read a great book called Call of the Reed Warbler by Charles Massey that really dives into regenerative ranching in Australia. And for those that are just listening in, Bobby grabbed the book off of his bookshelf behind him. And
Such a
if
good book.
you haven't read it, you have to jump in and read it, because it really gives you a great background and genesis on the Australian continent of where it came from. And Alan Savory is one of the features in the book. And to see a Zimbabwean farmer and rancher to explode onto the global scene, like what happened? Like, can you give a synopsis of this movement?
Man, I'll try, but I will say that Alan's life, I mean, there's so many components of it. But, long story short, Alan Savory is one of the founders of the Savory Institute, who we are named after. Alan is 84 years old today. He spends half the year in Zimbabwe, which is where he's from. Well, it was originally Rhodesia. And then, eventually that became Zimbabwe and Zambia. But he was so he spends half the year in Zim and then half the year in Florida. So, he switches between Africa and the US. Anyways, back in the 60s, he was a rangeland ecologist, studying, game, tracking game throughout Zimbabwe and just like monitoring the land, to like find animal tracks and signs of where they're going and all that sort of stuff. So he had a very close eye to what was happening at the ground level. He also then was in the military in Rhodesia. He led an elite tracker unit where basically they were tracking the guerrilla warfare activities that were happening during the Bush War. And so he had this really keen eye for paying attention to the ground. And what he realized during that time was that a lot of what people, quote, knew about what was happening to the land, the land is getting worse and worse as time goes on. And, what everyone, quote, knew was that livestock were the cause of that. And so he, as part of his rangeland ecologist work, believed in that because that's what he was told his entire life. And, the land was getting worse. And so, he and others within the government decided that they needed to cull elephants. There were too many elephants. So, 40,000 elephants, they were like, we need to get rid of them because we need to save the land for all the other wildlife. That's the sacrifice we need to make. And so they did that and they implemented that, and the land only got worse. And so that was a huge wake-up call for him. And if you watch Alan Savory's TED Talk, he talks about how that culling of the elephants was the greatest mistake in his entire life, and he will carry that to his grave. But he has essentially made it his life's work to basically dive into that and say, what is the mindset that caused people to say that it was the livestock were the problem, but it turns out that it actually wasn't the livestock because they got rid of the livestock and it continued to get worse. And when I say, I guess, elephants aren't livestock, but, it was the animals, the grazing herbivores that were destroying things. And so he really went and he looked at the various ecosystem processes and what was happening. And what he realized is there were pieces of land that were getting better with the presence of animals. So it wasn't just, it's animals are good or animals are bad, a very black or white. There was more to it than that. And what he realized, it is the movement and the activity and the presence of those animals and how they exist on the land and move across that land and migrate through it that indicates if land regenerates or degenerates over time. And to go back to that evolutionary biology perspective, that makes a lot of sense. Because if you think of, say, here in North America, there used to be, somewhere between 60 to 75 million bison that used to roam across North America. And because of their predators, they would stay in these tightly bunched herds, and they would graze the grasses and trample down the rest like a natural mulch. Their urine and dung would act as a natural fertilizer on the land, and then they'd move to fresh pasture, and they wouldn't return to that grazed area until the grasses had fully regrown and their deep perennial grass roots had fully regrown. And so there was this pulsation of graze and then rest that happened. And you see that same type of activity of like, well, you want to get a hard workout in, but then you need to rest and recover afterwards. And that's how you get stronger. The same thing happens with the land. Grasslands need to be grazed because grasslands and grazing herbivores co-evolved with one another for millions of years. And so it's not just, are there animals on the land? Yes or no. It's, are those animals in a tightly bunched herd and moving regularly across the land? And so he developed this methodology that, and largely inspired by the work of a French agronomist by the name of André Voisin, called rational grazing. And then he took into consideration this concept of holism, understanding that, grass isn't just grass. Grass is part of an ecosystem with, soil microbiology and animals and plants and humans and all sorts of different factors. And so he combines this concept of holism and rational grazing and combines them and brings in some of his military planning, which says, okay, how can we plan this out in a way that allows, farmers or ranchers or any type of land manager, how can we plan this out in a way that takes all the complexity of what's going on and allows you to simply see it on a nice chart? So you can say, okay, instead of just putting all of my animals out to pasture and leaving them out there for months at a time for an entire season, which is what many people do in the ranching world, that's just kind of what conventional practices are. Instead, let's bunch those animals together as if they had a predator out there. I mean, we don't really have the gray wolf. I mean, they're being reintroduced, but those populations don't exist like they used to. So let's have us, the humans, act like the predator to get that herd effect, and we can do that through herding or through portable electric fencing. And then let's plan their movements across our land from paddock to paddock. And then let's monitor the recovery rates of those grasses to make sure that they're able to fully regrow before we bring those animals back onto that piece of land. And that eventually became what is now known as holistic planned grazing. And that has become this absolutely game-changing planning procedure in the grazing space because it has allowed farmers and ranchers and even pastoralist communities in developing nations to implement practices that are going to reverse the trend, which has been land is getting worse and worse and worse as time goes on because of how we manage it, because of climate change and the feedback loops there, because of a host of different effects, rather than just be a victim of it. Now these land managers can implement this new planning procedure that allows them to graze in a way that gives that intense grazing and then adequate recovery that allows for regrowth and regeneration of the grasslands. And it's just this beautiful, beautiful thing to see in action.
And is it just applicable for cattle, or are we talking other types of livestock?
It's really any type of livestock. So any livestock will have the same effect on the land. There's slight differences in what their preferences are for the types of forage that they want to eat. But when you have them tightly bunched up, they're not as selective of what they're going to eat. So, you can have a herd of bison, you can have a herd of cattle, you can have sheep, you can have goats. There are people that use this with reindeer, for example, the Sami people in Norway, or, all different types of animals, as long as they are a ruminant, they've got that special organ, that rumen, the fourth chamber of the stomach that allows them to digest grass, that then you can implement holistic management or holistic planned grazing. Holistic management, which is more of the umbrella term of what we teach, kind of is the overarching concept that allows for the managing of complexity. So there's the grazing piece that we have, but that's really a tool that we provide to people. But a tool, you can use it properly or you can use it poorly. Like you can use a hammer to build a house, or you can hit someone upside the head with it. A tool isn't good or bad. It depends how you use it. Same thing with, cattle or any type of livestock. They aren't inherently bad. It's how you use them. It's how you graze them that matters. And so we teach the planning procedure, but we also teach this larger decision-making framework that allows people to balance the ecological needs with the financial and the social. So you're really taking this holistic perspective on everything that you do to make sure that you're getting, triple bottom line outcomes when you're managing, land and livestock together.
Yeah, I've got a great story about the triple bottom line. We were in Eastern Oregon in the Wallowa Mountains not that long ago, and we went to go skiing, but to stay on this regenerative ranch. And I was talking with a guy, and he had moved from Wyoming, and we're talking about his grazing and his background. And he said, in '89, I was broke, and I was going bankrupt, and I had a big farm. I inherited it from my dad and from his dad before that. And I was doing ranching the same way that they did it. But I had no other option in '89. I was going to go under and figure something else out to do. But I went to a talk by Alan Savory, and I had no choice but to listen to him about how to move my livestock around in a different way and manage with holism in mind. And he said that within 16 years, he was so profitable, he was able to pay off his farm.
Wow. Yeah.
And, 16 years, that's really not that long.
It's impressive. Well, especially when you consider, what most people deal with, in the agricultural sector. It's insane land prices and, decreasing, margins year over year, so people just really barely scraping by on razor thin margins in the agricultural space, oftentimes relying on, USDA programs, to really make up for the losses. And so, it seems like every generation, the temptation to sell the land and to quit farming or ranching just becomes greater and greater, which is why you see more and more development, and, kind of this consolidation of farmland towards, just these bigger and bigger players and, the loss of small farmers on the scene. But when you think of how to, when you take a holistic approach towards managing your operation, not just in how you graze your animals, but, from a financial perspective, what we, so we teach the holistic planned grazing. We also have a component called holistic financial planning. And we also have holistic land planning and ecological monitoring. There's various modules, but on the financial planning side of things, there's a way to think of things where, usually you're considering all the costs that go into things and thinking, okay, how can I just maximize my production here to make as much money as possible? But there is a reframing of how people look at their finances where you say, okay, you got all your overhead, just ignore the overhead because the overhead is going to exist whether you have 10 animals or 100 animals or 1,000 animals. Think of how you can optimize the production of what you have given the overhead expenses that are there. So you're looking at your gross margins. And in doing so, we are able to bring people to a place of understanding, okay, if I am, instead of thinking, how can I make my cows as fat as possible, as quickly as possible, rather than that, how can you look at things and say, okay, well, maybe my animals don't need to get as big, but maybe I have more of a moderate frame animal that I look for in terms of genetics. And in doing so, I'll have more animals, but they're smaller in stature, but the profit margin that you get on each animal might be a little bit bigger. And in doing so, you're going to be able to increase the margin that you make off of selling animals. There's all sorts of funny little tricks that, kind of conventional way of thinking about agricultural finance really, I think, gets people into a bind because they're like, well, this is what everyone does, is like, you want to fatten up your cows as quickly as possible. And that's how you make as much money. But in reality, like if you go for a more moderate frame animal and you have more of them, those animals are going to be more resilient. They're probably going to be healthier in terms of calving. There's like a variety of different, co-benefits that come along with that. And people end up making more money and being more resilient in the long term, from a financial and genetic, environmental, like all these different perspectives.
Very interesting. And what underpins it, and this is just the kicker for me, is that, the metric of success is the biology of the soil.
Yeah, it all comes back to, I often say that, people come to us looking to learn the grazing component, and we teach them that, but we teach them that as part of the entire thing. And so from day one, you're not going to learn grazing. You're going to learn holism and holistic decision making, because that's what's necessary. You have to change your mindset, really, if you're going to do things regeneratively. Like you can't take regenerative practices and implement them with a conventional mindset. It's going to ultimately lead to failure. So, we kind of I like to think of grazing as kind of like the carrot we dangle to people. And we're like, yeah, you want the grazing? Come and get it. And then they sign up for a week-long course, and they're just like, we kind of lay out this, whole holism thing. And it kind of forces a paradigm shift onto people and how they see the world. And they no longer consider themselves as cattle ranchers, but grass farmers. And, their whole goal is like, how can I grow better grass? Because if I do that, all the other dominoes fall and everything works out. And so it's like shifting the focus of like, you're focused on this because that's where everyone's focused on. But let's bring your focus over here a little bit and allow you to see that all these things are interconnected, the water and the soil and the carbon and the animals and your profits and planetary health and personal health. Like all this stuff ties in together. It's like the John Muir quote of like, when you pull on a string in nature, you see that everything is connected. Well, like you got to help people really understand. You can't just tell people that. You need them to see it and understand it deeply at their core. And when that happens, it changes everything.
Hey, everybody, this is Neil. We are going to get back to this great conversation in just 1 second. But I think it's fair to say that right now, we are facing some pretty unprecedented challenges in the 21st century. I mean, you name it, environmentally, socially, economically, we've got some big problems that we need to overcome. And that's why, for me personally, and the people that work with us at Latitude, we want to dedicate our time and our energy so that we are not only working to put food on the table and a roof over our heads, but also make the world a better place. And so if you are at all interested in combining your sustainability values with a very powerful financial model of real estate, then I highly encourage you to check out what we are doing at Latitude. We are creating something truly special with a tribe of change agents that for now is working across North America. And hopefully one day in the future, with you coming on board, we can be working across the globe. So please check us out. You can go to www.chooselatitude.com, or you can find us on social media at latitude.realty on Instagram, and we are also on Facebook. Okay, let's get back into it. The way that you're framing the grass farming, it echoes thinkers like Joel Salatin, who's a big proponent of that. And you're bringing him here. And the holism is particularly the experience that we went through as well for real estate. Once you realize, wow, the same regenerative principles, like if you were to look at a ranch, the farming and the ranching is that tool. It is the business that sits on top. And the people that I think are doing it really well are also bringing a permaculture approach to business of how do you stack functions on top of it. And at the end of the day, like the real drive is how do we add value? And that's bringing back biodiversity, reconnecting hydrology and carbon and all these other things.
Well, I think there's bringing back the value through improving the productivity of the land and, stacking enterprises, like you said, which is absolutely a piece of it. But I think something that a lot of people, neglect to consider often is the social aspect. And so, you could have, the best toolkit of grazing practices that's going to make the most amount of money. But if the people implementing that feel totally extracted and worn down, and they don't feel like, they are living their best lives or that they have a voice and that it's not what they want out of this, that system is ultimately going to fail. So like you can put a gun up against someone's head and say, hey, implement these regenerative practices. But as soon as that gun disappears, they're going to stop doing it if that's not what they want to do deep at their core. And so a big piece of holistic management is factoring in that social component. And step one of that is when whenever you're going to do anything in holistic management, is you develop what we call a holistic context. It's kind of like the North Star that you aim all of your efforts at. It's saying, what do I want life and my organization and my business and the environment? What do I want that to look and feel like? And who are the players that are involved in this? Whether it's the people that run the operation, that own the land, whether it's the workforce, anyone that has veto power, maybe it's a local municipality that, has a sense because, it's in conservation reserve program or like whatever it is. Get all the different players at the table so that they can agree from day one, this is the North Star where we're going. And if people come together and are able to share from the beginning of what they want, you're less likely to experience turbulence and trouble and conflict as you make decisions. Because if everyone has agreed from day one that this is where we're going, and not to say that this is the exact path we want to take, but this is the broad stroke direction we want to head in. We want a thriving, ranch that is profitable, but we're able to still have a balance with our family life so that we can take time off and go on vacation. And we want our children to inherit this property so that they can continue on with it. If you know that from day one and everyone else knows that from day one because you've all stated that that's collectively what you agree on, well, when you make decisions, okay, well, we're experiencing a drought. We're faced with some tough decisions. We could do A, B, or C. Well, you analyze those decisions and say which A, B, or C leads us most closely aligned with that holistic context, gets us the greatest marginal reaction, addresses root causes of things that are happening, is environmentally sustainable. There's this holistic context really keeps people in focus on what they truly want, because we as humans have a tendency to think in the very short term and kind of chase the shiny thing or hit the easy button. That's kind of how our DNA is built. We're genetically programmed to do that, and that doesn't always work in our favor. So you develop this North Star, this holistic context, and you make decisions in line with that. And when you do so, it allows you to keep the environmental, the financial, but also that social component in line the entire time, so that you're not just getting tremendous environmental benefit from what you're doing and making a killing, but everyone hates it and it's not going to survive in the long term. All three of those horses need to be moving at the same pace.
Yeah, what a really interesting way. It brings up so many different thoughts. I mean, even within our own internal team, we have a process called vivid vision of how do you point your compass towards that North Star, and then how do you develop an ecosystem with guilds underneath it of stakeholders that are going to help advance that mission. And even in regenerative development frameworks, they really talk about you need to root the vision in the future. And then start big and then go smaller, but bring in the key stakeholders that can do it. So what you're talking about with holism and grazing and how you've bunched those together to form holistic management is the exact same if you're looking at regenerative principles elsewhere. And I think that's so applicable towards thinking holistically is a great term for it, because we are so rooted in how do we solve the problems that we're experiencing today. And so if you're just looking at that short term of like, oh, I need to make more money here, or I need to stop doing this, then it's almost like we're always going to be playing catch up because we're rooted in the past. And building out the processes where we can emerge into many different futures, but hopefully one that we've already pointed our skis in that direction. Like, it's really cool. I'm putting a lot of dots together.
Well, so you said the word emerge, and I think that's a really important one. In and environmental contexts. From an ecological perspective, regeneration is an emergent property of a landscape that has been fully cared for. So that is an emergent property that comes about if you've addressed the underlying conditions of what an ecosystem needs for proper function. So, in what we teach, there are 4 different ecosystem processes. There is energy flow, how much sunlight is being captured by photosynthesis, so how much grass do you have actively photosynthesizing? There's the mineral flow, or mineral cycling, so minerals and, manure and all that stuff, decomposing into the soil to create fertility. There's the water cycle, ensuring that water is able to get absorbed into the land and, do its thing. And then there's the community dynamics. What is the interaction of all the different life forms that exist on that landscape? And a fully functioning ecosystem has to have all 4 of those pieces firing on all cylinders. So, we teach people in grazing to evaluate, the water cycles. You go around and you look at your land, and if it's like hard capped, you can kind of like knock on the ground and it sounds a little hollow. Well, the rain isn't going to penetrate into that soil. It's going to run off and become erosion. That's water that's falling that you're not able to use to grow grass. So how do you break up that hard cap? Well, you bring a herd of livestock onto it, and their hooves are going to break up that hard cap, which now allows the water to start coming in. And so that's one piece that you can look at. But from an ecosystem perspective, if you want regeneration to happen, you can't just focus on one individual component. Like a lot of people think regenerative ag and they think carbon sequestration. How do we remove CO2 from the atmosphere and put it into the soil? Well, yeah, you do that by having more photosynthesis happening because, photosynthesis pulls CO2, turns it into soil life. That's great, but that is not the end all be all indicator of ecosystem health. You also have to have the water cycles and the mineral cycles and the community dynamics, the plants and animals in right balance and a proper diversity of all of that. And so if you want regeneration to happen, you need to look at all of those underlying functions and say, how are these working? So you don't go to regenerate land and just say, I'm going to regenerate it by focusing on this one thing. You need to take a holistic look at the health of that land and say, how can I care for this land and make sure all of these ecosystem processes are working well? Well, you can take that from a land perspective and then switch that into more of an organizational perspective in terms of managing holistically. And this is what one of our old employees, he was our chief operating officer. He now runs his own organization called In Rhythm, and they basically teach people how to manage regenerative organizations. And they'll look at things that are like, instead of the energy flow, they'll look at communication flow within an organization. Are people communicating adequately and quickly enough for decisions to be made? What about the biodiversity of thoughts and perspectives and skill sets that you have on your team or within your organization? What about decision making? Do people feel like they have the ability to make decisions and change when you need to? There's all different ways to reconceptualize all these practices that originated from land management, but take that same holistic decision-making framework and use them in an organizational context. And in doing so, what you're doing is not saying, I want to maximize profitability in my organization, but rather, how do I care for the people that make up this organization? How do I make sure that they are all able to express their unique genius and so that they are cared for and in the seat that best suits who they are? And then how do I support them? And how do we make sure there's a diversity of perspectives and that they're all communicating and making decisions in the right way? And when you focus on those underlying conditions, regeneration is that emergent property of the organization. So your focus isn't on profitability, but it's on the people and caring for them. Same thing with land and livestock, if you focus on the land and ensuring that it functions properly, it's going to regenerate and you're going to be profitable in the long term.
And that right there, ladies and gentlemen, is why we wanted to have Bobby Gill come on. Oh man, we could just end it with that. That was beautiful. It really was. And I get a lot of inspiration out of that.
I cannot take credit for that. That is the work of Trey Cates, who runs In Rhythm. He has, he's one of the original employees of Savory Institute. He's been working on this with years, spent a lot of time with Alan in Zimbabwe, basically just batting ideas off of him of like, well, what if we did things? So like, Alan, you say that holistic management can be used outside of land and livestock, for organizations or economies or, whatever. But how do we do that? And so he worked on it for years. And it's really beautiful to see how that's emerged, because now, they're out there working with all types of different organizations. And I think really tip of the spear in terms of, reinventing how organizations operate. And, that's how we at the Savory Institute, operate, in terms of collective decision-making and, really focusing on the people rather than just the bottom line. And, it's a really impactful and really meaningful place to work. You feel really supported and cared for, and like what you have to contribute actually matters. And when you feel like you as an individual are cared for, and you have that security that it's not just like, oh, I'm a cog in a wheel that can be replaced, it brings life to everything that you do, and you want to contribute more because you feel like you really matter. And so when everyone feels like that and everyone's contributing more because they feel genuinely cared for, it's, the outcomes are totally incredible.
Yeah, we had a recent podcast episode with an amazing entrepreneur named Keith Bowers that is the founder of Biohabitats. And he talks about really restructuring his organization to go much more horizontal, to bring in this regenerative lens on how to manage and organize, and that there's really no hierarchy there. Bobby, I got a couple more questions for you here. You might have answered one, and I'm kind of dancing around a very sensitive subject. Hopefully my in-laws' families aren't listening to this, but they're cattle ranchers out of South Dakota. And it's almost like they have I don't know the word to describe it, but whenever we're talking about regenerative ranching, like because we have this interest in it, they're like, oh, we've been doing rotational grazing since the 90s. We learned about that from an ag extension officer. And then you read about AMP and things like that. And it's like, I don't even know if we're talking about the same thing between regenerative grazing and regenerative agriculture, just to high intensity moving of animals around. What do you say about that?
Yeah, well, a lot of people think that those are the same thing. And there are certainly commonalities between them. Like I explained, trying to, from that evolutionary biology perspective, how did the bison roam? Okay, let's bunch them up in, a tight herd and move them regularly. That is what, people are trying to accomplish with rotational grazing. I'd say the difference really lies in the things that you're paying attention to and how you are making decisions with that. So with rotational grazing, it's often, okay, I'm going to divide my land up into, even pasture sizes and just move my animals, a week here, a week here, a week here, whatever it is, and you move them around. And you just keep that cycle going. It's the rotation of it, hence the name rotational grazing. Where I think a lot of people fall short in that is, from a holistic planned grazing perspective, if you go and you really dive into there's a handbook that we have. It's the Holistic Management Handbook. I don't know if the video is being shown, but anyone on audio. So this Holistic Management Handbook that we have is a whole bunch of different worksheets and diagrams and explainers that really dig into the nuance of how and why you graze at certain times. And some of the main components that I think are missed from a rotational grazing perspective, the big one really is honoring and planning with the recovery rates of your grasses as being the main thing that indicates if you move your animals to a piece of land or not. In rotational grazing, you're going to move them according to the schedule. In holistic planned grazing, you're going to move them onto a new pasture if and only if that land is ready to receive those animals. The planning procedures that we have in holistic planned grazing, I think I alluded to, part of that was from Alan's military days in terms of military planning procedures. In holistic planned grazing, we have this big chart, that people put up on their walls, and across the top are the days of the year, and across the side are the different paddocks that you move your animals between. And then you mark it up with all the different things you need to know, like, oh, there's ground nesting birds in this paddock during this time of year. We have a field day right here. Here we're on vacation. Over here, because of CRP, we're not allowed to be in. You mark it up with all the different things. And then it's not just a simple move from paddock 1 to paddock 2 to paddock 3, but rather, okay, with all of the variables at play, and saying, okay, this pasture, which is this size, and it has this quality forage, this gets us this animal unit days. There's a whole bunch of math and calculations that you do based on how many animals you have, how big are they at that time of year. That equates to how much forage that they need. You match that to the amount of forage that is available in a specific paddock. So it's like, okay, paddock 1, we need to be there between 3 to 7 days. And then we're going to jump over into paddock 10R. And then that one, we can spend somewhere between 6 and 9 days, based on all these calculations that you do. And it ends up being not just a simple rotation of moving around on the land, because that that's what's needed, but rather you're making decisions that matches how many animals you have, how much forage is available, and then moving based on all the different factors at play, and really honoring that recovery rate of your grasses to make sure that they are fully regrown. Because if you come in and graze on a piece of grass before it's fully regrown, you're cutting that life short for that piece of grass. And if you keep doing that over time, that grass is eventually going to die off. So you really need to keep the recovery and growth rates of the grasses in mind when making these decisions. And it's not as simple as just going out and looking. There's a lot of calculations involved. It's not rocket science. That's why we have the handbook, and, we've got a grazing compendium that goes along with these grazing charts. But, there's a lot more to it than just bunching them up and moving them around.
Very interesting. This next conversation, I'm going to try to tiptoe in gracefully, because we might just get everybody hating us. And it's a phenomenon that we're experiencing globally, that I want to preface this with a philosopher named Charles Eisenstein calls this a false debate, but between the vegans and the regenerative agriculture folks, there's just this extreme tension going on right now. And it's funny because they both have the same sentiments towards, hey, we want to combat climate change and see the earth restored. But both are catching headlines. I mean, 2 days ago, the Savory Institute was in the New York Times. A year ago, the Game Changers movie was like the #1 blockbuster on Netflix. Like, what is your take on these two camps that just, I don't know, it seems like they're magnets of different polarity.
I think anyone would agree that if you take a broad look at what's happening in the modern era, we are experiencing tribalism, to the fullest extent. And, that's part of our DNA. We are tribal people. We become part of our tribe, and there is a safety in that. But that has kind of leaked out into these different ideologies. And, from an environmental perspective, that has, reared its ugly head as the, kind of pro-meat regenerative world, and then the anti-meat, anti-livestock, vegan, PETA type folks. And it's become this head-to-head match. And I think people want that because it fires up the support of the people in that group if they feel like they have a camp to be a part of. It's like my football team versus your football team, rah, 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 fight to the death. And like, that's what we do. Ultimately, though, I think that conflict has been artificially created, and I don't think that's really where the conflict should lie. I find that if I meet a vegan or a vegetarian or someone who they eat meat, but they believe that they should eat less of it because it's harmful to the planet, what I see in that is someone who cares for the planet and wants to create a better world. You talked about Charles Eisenstein, someone who wants to create that more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible. That's one of my favorite books. And, I think about it kind of on a spectrum, and it's kind of a U-shaped curve, like a horseshoe. On one end, we've got the anti-meat, anti-livestock vegan. And then on the other side, we've got, the pro-livestock regenerative. We're actually very close to each other on that horseshoe. Who we're furthest away from is all the people up at the other end of that horseshoe who are really just checked out, and they don't care where their food comes from. They don't care, what happens to this planet. They only care about their individual, bubble that they're worried about. And they're like, it's just me and it's just my thing. And that's all I care about, environmental stuff, like whatever. It's like, who am I? They're just kind of really agnostic towards the whole thing. And I think those people are the ones that we really need to be focused on. I think that is really the true enemy, not to say it's an us versus them, but I think that is where that points to where the work needs to be done, is the people that don't care about the planet and don't care about what we're passing off to future generations. That is what a majority of people believe. And the result of, or, the outcome of that is that we then have this industrialized food system where you have no clue when you go to the supermarket where your food comes from. If you did see photos or videos of how those animals were raised or what the land looked like when those, crops were grown, you'd be disgusted by it because it would fly in the face of what you think agriculture is supposed to be based on all the slick marketing that we see. I mean, like, you can go and pick up a gallon of milk at the supermarket and it's got green grass and a bright sun and like a red barn and a smiling cow. And you're like, oh, this is great. Yeah, I'm going to drink this milk. But like, if you actually saw the conditions that those cows lived in, that came from, chances are it's some sort of disgusting feedlot where they're stomping around in their own manure. And like, it's just gross. But we've kind of taken agriculture and, as humans, we have, for most of our existence on this planet, we have had this deep, innate connection with the natural world. We were hunter-gatherers for so long. And then 10,000 years ago, agriculture, and we started domesticating plants and animals and settling down and creating towns and cities and all of that. And then the Industrial Revolution, 200 years ago, and then everything became super industrial. All of this industrialization and domestication has really only been a blink of an eye in the ancient past of how we have lived on this planet. So like, from a genetic perspective, our biology wants to be connected with nature. We want to know how our food has been raised. We have those deep truths within us that allows us to say this is what a nice environment is. It's like why we're called to the outdoors to do outdoor activities. It's why golf is such a huge sport, because it gets people out from a business setting in a workplace and gets them out into a green, open landscape, because that touches on something that's deep inside of you that says, oh, you as a human should be in nature. But we've kind of developed over it. We've industrialized our agricultural system, and it's really unfortunate. And so to get back to that question, because I know I kind of went off on a tangent there. I somehow brought up golf when you asked about vegans.
You're the only one on this show that's ever talked about golf.
It's the first time I've ever done it as well. But, I think what it speaks to ultimately is we as a society today are the most ecologically illiterate society that has ever existed on this planet. We are the most removed from nature that we have ever been. And the outcome of that is we have forgotten how the natural world operates. When people are out there claiming we need to get rid of all livestock, what essentially they are saying is, well, those 5 billion hectares of grasslands that we have across the globe, 1/3 of the Earth's landmass, to hell with it. We don't need those animals. And what that's going to do is when you remove grazing animals from grasslands, those two have co-evolved with each other for millions of years. And you remove the grazing from the grasslands, those grasslands are going to die. And that's going to further contribute towards climate change and just the rapid decline of all these global crises that we're seeing. So you can't just say, get rid of livestock. That's, a very short-sighted, ecologically incorrect statement to make. What people should be saying is, I do not like the factory farming of plants or animals. It's feedlots that are a huge problem, but it's not just the factory farming of animals in feedlots. It's also the factory farming of plants, huge, big monocultures that are sprayed with, fossil fuel derived, fertilizers and, herbicides and fungicides and insecticides and big, massive combines that are, driven across it. That factory farming of plants, that factory farming of animals, they both fall into the category of the industrialization of agriculture. And that really flies in the face of what the living natural world needs, which is more of these nature-based solutions. And, ultimately, I think what all of this ties back to is, farming in nature's image, whether that's how you grow plants together as a polyculture of them, or an integrated crop livestock scenario where you've got cover crops and annuals and the cows are grazing at a certain time of the year, or maybe you've got silvopasture where you've got, fruit orchards and timber and cows come in and graze. It's that integrated world that has always existed, and we have broken apart from that. So when I see a vegan, if I can have a real conversation with them of how a grassland landscape operates, and that grasslands need to be grazed, and that, hey, you don't need to eat this meat or drink this milk or wear this leather or wear this wool or whatever it is, but you should care that these grasslands are grazed properly, because all of our continued existence on this planet depends on that. And so I think if we're able to have that type of dialogue that moves beyond the tribalism of us versus them and instead dives into all the nuance of how things operate, I think there's a lot of potential in that.
Oh, I like that. And I think to drive home this point, everybody needs to drive through the San Joaquin Valley in California and see that it's not that sunny in California, and it is pretty freaking scary.
It is.
I make this comment from being squarely in the vegan camp as well as in the meat camp. And the vegan side, whenever we were eating that way, we very, very much compelled towards we're shifting from eating for me to eating for we. And it wasn't until I had a great discussion with Mark Shepard, who was on this podcast, where he was really hammering home, we need to shift from annual consumption to perennial. And you're like, the vegan diet is really not based on perennials. It's very much based on big monoculture crops of annuals. And that started to bring in a nuance. But then there's this pretty big Facebook group about regenerative agriculture and grazing. And the founder of the group posted something the other day that he was only going to eat beef for a month, nothing else. And I'm like, well, that's a terrible idea as well. And so you see both of these camps, and you just have to wonder, like, wow, they're coming from the same place, but the downside I do see of the meat tribalism, and I love that word, how you brought it up, is that it's almost like it allows people to slip, of not just like, hey, I'm going to go source regenerative grown beef or livestock of whatever it is, but like I'm going to go out to that restaurant and it's given me permission just to order carte blanche across the menu, and that's okay because I'm doing the world good. And it's like, well, wait a second, there's actually a pretty big distance between that.
I think it speaks to our desire to take the complexity that exists in the natural world and reduce it down to something very simple, very black or white. Like, we don't want to make so many decisions. Our brain requires 25% of all of our, energy consumption. And so anything we can do to simplify our decision-making by saying, okay, I'm part of this camp, so I'm going to do what this group says because other people have made the decisions and I don't have to, like that's the route that we go, is we reduce things down into this very simple form and then try to follow that as a set of rules, rather than saying, well, there's a lot of complexity here. And yeah, I could just eat 100% meat that's all grown regenerative. Or like, what does my unique body need from a nutritional standpoint? Maybe I'm someone who does better on meat. Maybe I'm someone who does better on a little less meat, and I need more starchy vegetables. How do I, make up for some of the needs that I have because my genetic makeup, personally, I'm 50% Polish and then, 50%, other European stuff. Like, from my genetic makeup, what is most appropriate that I would have eaten historically? What types of foods? What would my exercise would have looked like? How much vitamin D do I absorb from the sun based on the color of my skin? And does that mean I should supplement vitamin D or not? And like, there's all sorts of things that are unique to you and your individual context. And people want to outsource that to others. And when you do that, you miss the complexity and you ultimately end up having unintended consequences. So ultimately, what we all need to do is embrace our unique context of who we are, what it is we want. It comes back to developing that holistic context and saying, what do you want in life? What do you want out of this world? And like, define that, figure that out, and then make decisions that move in that direction. And there's no one set of directions that you can give to everyone. It's going to be different for each person. And those decisions are going to change on a day-to-day basis, depending on all the changing variables that are, come at you. If you're hit with a drought, or there's some blight that runs through, or there's a global pandemic, or, Texas loses energy, or, like all these sorts of things are different variables that you need to factor in when you make decisions, whether that's managing your personal health and the food that you eat, whether it's managing your organization and how you manage the employees, or whether it's how you manage your livestock or, your farming operation. It all comes down to that holistic perspective and honoring, what is needed at that foundational level.
I'm going to put this out there that you're the most lucid new parent I've ever talked to.
My daughter is 12 weeks old, and she slept in until 7:15 this morning.
I'm just like,
so I'm going to chalk it up to a good night's sleep.
Oh, that's incredible. Well, okay, let's wrap up here because this has been incredible. The last two things. First, I've heard Alan doesn't wear shoes, and I'd love to know if that's true or not. And second, where can people learn more about getting into regenerative grazing?
So to the first part of your question, Alan does not often wear shoes. That was actually, I talked about how him being a game tracker, and then, that elite tracker unit, in the Rhodesian military, he would walk around barefoot through the bush in Africa because that allowed him to move about quieter and not leave tracks where he went. And in doing so, one thing that he noticed was land that was covered in vegetation, where there was grass, was much cooler to the touch than land that did not have grass on it. And so it speaks a little bit towards, like little microclimates that you get from, evapotranspiration, but healthy soil is cooler to the touch than exposed soil. And so like that was one of his, aha moments where he realized, oh, like from a tactile feedback perspective, he realized that these felt differently. And if this land is warmer than this land, that's going to function very differently. And, the water's going to evaporate quicker over here and, this, that, and the other thing. So walking barefoot is something that he originally did from a tracking perspective, but it allowed him to glean these really incredible insights on how the land, works, just because he had more sensations, to make decisions from and, to factor in. So he generally walks around barefoot, but, I've seen him in shoes every once in a while. It's usually like if you're at a conference or a keynote, he's not going to walk up barefoot on stage. But, if you're out on the land, you can guaranteed, very calloused feet. They're not the most pretty things to look at, but they have seen some things.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So let's say somebody just bought an 80-acre ranch and they wanted to get into holistic management. Where would they go? Yeah. Where would they go do that?
Well, so at Savory Institute, I didn't really talk a lot about how we operate, but we've got a global network of regional learning hubs. They're all accredited through the Savory Institute. They're all independently run, independently operated, and so they all, kind of like I was saying, operate by their own unique context. So they all kind of operate a little bit differently depending on what is necessary in their region, based on their geography and soil and markets and social norms and all that sort of stuff. So what I would do is, if you're looking to implement holistic management, you want to learn more, you go to Savory's website, savory.global. And if you click on hubs, we've got a list of all the different Savory hubs. Find the Savory hub that's closest to you, reach out, see what types of courses or workshops or field days or, consulting opportunities that are coming up. If you don't have a Savory hub that's as close as you'd like, we've got about 48 of them around the world right now, but we're not everywhere yet. We have online courses, which, are more about the fundamentals of the holistic decision-making and understanding the ecosystem processes. There's also the holistic management textbook and the holistic management handbook. I recommend both of those together. The textbook is really the why behind all of this. And the handbook, like I said, is more of the charts and worksheets and diagrams. That's the how, how to implement. So, a couple different paths, again, depending on whatever is appropriate for you.
Perfect. And everybody listening, this is exactly why we wanted to have Bobby on. This was a fantastic and very enlightening conversation. I really appreciate your time. And this was, it was just exceeded expectations.
I appreciate it. It's been a really fun conversation. And, I really like it when we're able to take a step beyond just the grazing and ecological piece, because I think that's where a lot of people want to focus. And that piece is really important. But, from that holistic perspective, you got to hit on all those different sides. And when you do, I think it really paints a very clear picture of how all of this works and how all of it can operate. And I think it brings a lot of hope. So I appreciate you allowing me to dive into all, those fun little gray areas today.
Okay, everybody, that is a wrap. This is another just great episode that I'm so glad that you're able to tune in. And thank you for being interested in regenerative real estate. What we are trying to do is help people and planet thrive together by using the built environment as a catalyst. And so I've got a couple big asks for you. Number one is, can you please go to wherever you're listening to this podcast, leave us a rating and review. Those actually go so far. And since this is such a passion project for us, we really want to be able to attract the best thought leaders from around the world. Second is that if you really like the content that we're putting out, you can find us on our own Medium publication called Regenerative Real Estate. We also have a very active community on Facebook, which is called Regenerative Real Estate and Design, which you can request to be a part of, and we would love to have you. And third, this goes to what we do every single day, helping buyers and sellers demystify sustainability by working with people that want to either buy a property and are trying to figure out the financing of how do I actually live out my values? How do I put that water catchment system on there? Or how do I go finance a solar panel PV array? Or maybe I want to live closer to nature. And what are the properties that are out there that I can do that? And so we represent buyers like that. We also happen to represent sellers that maybe they've already invested in sustainable features. Maybe they have a living building or a LEED certified project. We want to help tell that story. So much of what goes on in the real estate industry is transactional thinking at best, and it translates down into agents just really don't know anything about sustainability. And for us, we think that the value is there, and we want to help highlight really the intrinsic value of it, not just the bedrooms and the baths and the square feet of what typical marketing goes on. So if you know of anybody that wants to buy or sell these kinds of properties that we're talking about, please reach out to us at Latitude, and be sure to subscribe for another great episode coming up next week.